After the Civil War ended in 1865, many African Americans believed that the freedom they so desperately sought would finally be realized. 3 amendments were added to the U.S. Constitution. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. The 14th Amendment protected the rights of the newly freed slaves, and the 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote. During the period after the Civil War, known as Reconstruction, African Americans were elected to many high offices in the southern states. Some even served in the United States Congress. It seemed as if these former slaves were finally allowed to enjoy their newfound freedom. But most Southern whites were determined to keep the African Americans poor, uneducated, and powerless. When federal troops left the South after the Reconstruction, white politicians used corruption and force to reestablish their power. They met little opposition from the federal government. The Ku Klux Klan was formed and used terrorism and violence against the black people of the South. Between 1882 and 1901, nearly 2,000 African Americans were killed by lynching. Segregation laws, also known as Jim Crow laws, began to appear all over the South. African Americans were ordered to use separate restrooms, water fountains, restaurants, and bus seats. In the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, handed down in 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that these separate facilities were legal as long as they were equal. Even though the facilities for African Americans in the South were never equal, Jim Crow laws governed the South for 58 years. The struggle for civil rights was just beginning, and it would take the courage and determination of one man to see it reach its completion some 70 years later. This is his story. We present to you now Martin Luther King Jr., a man and his dream. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929, in this house in Atlanta, Georgia. His father, the Reverend Martin Luther King Sr., was a minister, his mother a school teacher. By 1932, his father had become pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, one of the biggest churches in the city of Atlanta. Even though Martin grew up in the midst of the Great Depression, his father's position in the community allowed them to live modestly in a middle-class neighborhood. Being a bright, gifted student, Martin was allowed to skip several grades and graduated from Booker T. Washington High School at the age of 15. Martin enrolled at Morehouse College in Atlanta in 1944. It was here at this all-black college, known for its high academic standards, that Martin studied sociology and decided to become a minister. His father gave him a chance to deliver a guest sermon at the Ebenezer Baptist Church. Crowds of people came to hear young Martin speak. For weeks, people talked about the young pastor's forceful sermon. In 1947, he entered Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, to obtain his divinity degree. It was at Crozer that Martin first learned of Mohandas K. Gandhi, a leader in India's struggle for independence from Britain. After many years of nonviolent protests, strikes, and boycotts, Gandhi and his followers finally won India's freedom in 1947. Martin was fascinated by Gandhi's methods of protest, known as passive resistance. He wondered if these nonviolent practices could succeed in America's segregated South. After receiving his divinity degree, he enrolled at Boston University to earn his doctorate in theology. While attending Boston University, he met and fell in love with Coretta Scott, a student at the New England Conservatory of Music. On June 18, 1953, they were married. The following year, Martin was invited to become the pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Martin wasn't sure how to respond to the invitation. He and Coretta were not happy about the idea of moving back to the segregated South. But things were about to change. On May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court announced its decision in the landmark case of Brown versus Board of Education. It stated that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. The 1896 case of Plessy versus Ferguson was dealt a decisive blow. Martin knew that this was the beginning of important changes for African Americans, and he wanted to be in the South to help. Martin accepted the church's invitation, and he and Coretta were soon living in Montgomery. He was awarded his doctorate from Boston University in June of 1955. He could now be called Dr. Martin Luther King. In November of that year, their first child, Yolanda, was born. She was the first of 4 children they would have together. All seemed right for Martin and Coretta, but that would change in just a matter of weeks. On December 1st, 1955, a black seamstress named Rosa Parks boarded a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. When she was asked to give up her seat to a white man, she politely refused. She was told by the bus driver that if she did not give up her seat, he would have her arrested. Rosa Parks told the bus driver to go right ahead. She would not move. The bus driver stopped the bus, found a local policeman, and had her arrested. A friend named Edie Nixon posted her bail and later called Martin and Coretta to tell them about the incident. Nixon advised Martin that a boycott of the Montgomery bus system was the only way to show the city that they were not going to take this kind of abuse anymore. This was the beginning of the modern civil rights movement. What Rosa Parks did on that December day would make history, and for Martin Luther King, it was an opportunity to test Gandhi's practice of passive resistance. King called a meeting of African American leaders, including his friend and fellow pastor Ralph Abernathy. Together, they organized the Montgomery Improvement Association. King was elected president. The association decided that if the 50,000 Montgomery blacks stopped riding the buses, the city would lose money and that the boycott would gain national attention. They scheduled the first boycott for December 5th and started to spread the word. When December 5th arrived, not one African American was seen riding the Montgomery buses. They began to walk many miles to work. Black cab drivers drove as many people as possible for only 10 cents a ride. Carpooling became everyday practice. The city began to lose money, and city officials began a campaign of arresting the boycotters for any small violation. Martin Luther King was arrested for driving 30 miles an hour in a 25-mile-per-hour zone. A crowd of African Americans responded to King's arrest by quietly surrounding the jail. He was quickly released. Outside the jail, he spoke out on his opposition to violence.
We still advocate nonviolence, passive resistance, and still determined to use the weapon of love.
But violence was something that many African Americans would continue to endure. On January 30th, 1956, a bomb was thrown on the front porch of the King's home. Fortunately, no one was hurt. Martin knew that his struggle would constantly meet with opposition, but the bus boycott continued. After 382 days of boycotting the Montgomery bus system, the United States Supreme Court ruled that segregation on city buses violated the Constitution and had to be abolished. On December 21, 1956, Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, and a white minister named Reverend Glenn Smiley rode in the front seats of the first non-segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Gandhi's practice of nonviolent protest had worked and made Dr. King a national figure. In January of 1957, King, along with other black ministers, formed the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They elected Martin as their president. Their goal was to promote civil rights all over the South. In early 1960, Martin and his family moved back to Atlanta, Georgia, where Martin joined his father as co-pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church. On February 1st of that year, 4 black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat down at a Woolworth's lunch counter and insisted on being served in this whites-only establishment. They never were. They were simply ignored. The word began to spread of these brave college students, and soon there were sit-ins at lunch counters all over the South. Dr. King's message of nonviolent protest was being felt everywhere. By 1961, many whites had joined King's movement. The Congress of Racial Equality organized what was to be known as the Freedom Riders. These were groups of blacks and whites who joined together to test the Supreme Court's ruling to integrate buses. They rode buses all over the South. Some of the buses were bombed. Some people were beaten by white mobs who met the buses at stops along the way. It was at these stops that the Freedom Riders would enter white-only facilities to non-violently protest the continuing segregation of African Americans. In the spring of 1963, King and his followers decided to peacefully demonstrate in Birmingham, Alabama. Many people considered Birmingham to be the most racially segregated city in the country. While they demonstrated throughout the city, the local police used fire hoses and attack dogs to deter them. King and several of